that you mentioned at the beginning, the question, do prisoners get it?
Mm.
And then we didn't actually hear the answer to that. So what happens if I'm in, if I'm in a maximum security prison doing 20 years, and someone's got their mic on, sorry. Do I then accumulate this massive amount of universal wellbeing payment in my bank account while the government's already paying for my food and accommodation in the form of a prison cell?
So I reckon this was probably the question that caused the most debate amongst my Greens colleagues and the people that we were consulting with on this. In the end, we came down on the side of, if you are in prison for effectively a non-violent offence, for a minor offence, and your prison term would then be very unlikely to be more than 2 years. The vast majority of offences fall within that under 12-month imprisonment time. You're still going to have all of those expenses outside of prison that are still, rent and perhaps some dependents, and that it would be helpful overall for the justice system if when you got out of prison, you still had those things and you still had that stable home. So that was a bit easier. But then when you look at, what if somebody's committed a really violent crime and they're in prison for 20 years? What do you do with those people? And we concluded that the only way to really work that out would be to look at the circumstances of the case. So we're going to have to rely on the judge to direct where that universal wellbeing payment goes. For instance, if the offender does have dependents, perhaps it goes to the dependents, or perhaps it gets redirected towards the cost of having that person in prison. You have to be very careful with that, though, because with the advent of privatised prisons, you don't want the idea that you would get someone's universal wellbeing payment as being an incentive to imprison more people. So it's quite a tricky.
I'm assuming that the Greens are pretty firmly against private prisons anyhow. So in that context, it would be another consideration. So, but I mean, essentially what we're saying is that there's no one-size-fits-all answer for prisoners, and that would be something that courts would have to decide, like they decide other issues around sentencing at the moment.
Yeah.
Now, I've got a couple of people asking questions. One that Stephen's asked one about automation and full employment, but we'll come back to that, Stephen. I'll get you to ask that on the microphone in a bit. However, Jacqueline's asked, has suggested that it would be a good strategy to have dollars ready when a prisoner without dependents came out of prison, maybe start the payment prior 3 months prior to release. We don't have to get into the details, but there is a pretty strong case that if you want someone to come out of prison, you're going to have not the easiest time in the world finding a job and getting set up, that maybe them having a little bit of cash with which to reestablish their life isn't the worst thing in the world. Was that part of the deliberations?
Yeah, and it comes back to what do you see prison as and what is the purpose of prison? And again, a vast majority of prisoners are there because they haven't had money to begin with. And I think that, if you can, if your purpose is to actually rehabilitate people and put people back into society in a way that means that they're not going to reoffend, having that financial safety net, I think, is going to be really important.